So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to tonight's lecture by Professor Omer Bartov. My name is Enrico Boccaccini. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. I will be moderating tonight. Just that you're informed, we are recording and streaming this event. You will not be on the picture. The video is only of the speaker. So I want to start by thanking my colleagues and students who support me organizing and advertising this event. And I very much needed the support because unfortunately organizing such an event on this issue is not a given in this country and this university. And this despite the academic excellence of tonight's guest, who has been a leading scholar of his field for so many years. Omer Bartov is Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. Born in Israel and educated at Tel Aviv University and Oxford University, Omer Bartov's early research concerned the Nazi indoctrination of the Wehrmacht and the crimes committed in World War II, analyzed in his book, Eastern Front 1941 to 1940. He then turned to the links between total war and genocide, discussed in his books, Murder in Our Midst, Mirrors of Destruction, and Germany's War and the Holocaust. His more recent works focused on inter-ethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. His book, Anatomy of Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Uchach, is a micro-history of a multi-ethnic Eastern European community tracking its descent from coexistence and violence during World War II. The book received the National Jewish Book Award and the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research, among others. Based on a distinguished career of research and genocide, mass violence, and inter-ethnic relations, Professor Omer Bartov has in recent years turned increasing attention to his home country, seeking to understand the events of October 7 and their aftermath within a broader historical perspective. Already in November 2023, Professor Bartov published an op-ed in the New York Times entitled What I Believe as a Historian of Genocide, in which he argued that Israel was already committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and warned that the military campaign could become genocidal if it were not stopped. Several months later, Professor Bartov came to the conclusion that Israel was in fact committing genocide against the Palestinian people. How he arrived at this conclusion is part of the subject of the book he's presenting today. And this is the British edition, Israel, What Went Wrong. In this book, which I today learned will come out in Germany after some uncertainty, Professor Bartov examines the historical trajectory of Zionism, the political and social transformation of the Israeli state, and the escalation of oppression and violence that, in his view, have led Israel to face growing international accusations of war crimes and genocide. Drawing on decades of research into nationalism, mass violence, the Holocaust, and genocide, Professor Bartov will help us today situate the current catastrophe in Gaza and the broader domination of Palestinians within a longer historical and ideological context. And since we are here in Jena, only 30 kilometers from Buchenwald, I also invited Professor Bartov to address what he sees as the particular role and historical responsibility of the German state, society, academia, and memorial institutions such as Buchenwald, an institution closely connected to the University of Jena, in relation to the current genocide in Gaza. So we are privileged to have him with us, and I'm privileged to introduce him. Professor Bartov.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on this wonderful steamy evening. I will try in the next 45 minutes or so to speak a bit about this book that has just come out, and to my pleasure as was just mentioned, will also be coming out in German, in Edition Einwurf, which is not the most well-known publisher in Germany. 2 or 3 days later, I found out that the book will also be coming out in Hebrew. And on the same day, I found out that the book is coming out in Arabic. So these are the most important languages from my point of view for this book, and I'm very happy that this is happening. But it's not a happy book, so I'll tell you some things about it. In the fall of 2022, between October 2022 and the 1st of January 2023, I was in Israel. I spent 3 months in Israel, and I was interviewing large numbers of people. I was interviewing about 55 people, about 2/3 of them Jewish Israelis, and about 1/3 Palestinian citizens of Israel, 1948 Palestinians. And all the people I spoke with were members of my generation. Those people born more or less in the first decade after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And my main question to all the people I interviewed was, what is your connection to the place? And I didn't really define what I meant by connection or what I meant by place. And this led to very intensive conversations, about 2 to 3 hour conversations, most of the time with those people speaking to me and me simply listening to them. And I mention this because, of course, I left Israel on October 1st, 2023. By then, there had been an election in Israel. The current coalition that is still ruling Israel quite extraordinarily was being formed, and the so-called judicial overhaul, which was really a judicial coup, the attempt to limit the powers of the judiciary in Israel, particularly the Supreme Court, was beginning. This motion was just beginning. But the people I spoke with, of course, did not know what, nor did I, where all of this was heading. And one very important conclusion that I drew from these conversations, which, as I said, were very moving, was supposed to be a book that I got distracted from writing because of the events of October 7th, and which I will be writing now. One conclusion from that was that all the people, most of the people, there were some exceptions, had a very strong connection to the place. And most of those people, with very few exceptions, grew up in deeply traumatized families. Whether it was because they were children of people who experienced the Nakba, and there was a great deal of talk about that because people spoke a lot about their parents. Much of the interview was about their parental homes, or because, of course, their parents, their grandparents, their families have experienced the Holocaust, and many members of their families were killed, were murdered, and often their parents had a very complicated relationship with the place that they came from, not least from Germany. So this was, for me, very instructive, because as of beginning in 2015, more or less, I became increasingly interested, as you just said, in the place where I grew up. And one thing that made me think about it differently was a previous piece of research that I was doing. I spent about 20 years studying my mother's hometown of Buchach. I thought it would be a very quick book. It would take me about 2 years. It's a small town. I wanted to know what happened there during the Holocaust, and it became a 20-year project because I had to learn much more East European Jewish history, Ukrainian history, Polish history, German history. I knew a fair amount about already. And while I was doing that research, I went there. I went to the place of my mother's hometown, which is now in West Ukraine. When she was born and raised there, it was in Poland, and before World War I, it was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now it's West Ukraine. And one thing that struck me when I went there was this is now a almost purely Ukrainian area. And before the war, it was Ukrainian or Ruthenian majority with a very large Polish minority and a substantial Jewish minority. And all that history has been erased. In fact, I wrote a book in 2007 called Erased, which was about that. And yet, when you go there, there's still remnants of what there was. You see abandoned cemeteries with children, Ukrainian children, herding their goats. You see shells of synagogues. Most of these towns, including Buchach, are surrounded by mass graves. There are about 7,000 people in mass graves. The community, the Jewish community of Buchach, in unmarked graves around the town. And I asked myself, what do people think when they grow up there? When they take the goats of cows and they see a cemetery and there's stones there in a language they don't know, does anyone tell them what there was before the war? And there was a civilization there that had lasted for at least 400 years, where Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians lived side by side, and it was wiped out. And the memory was erased. Now, I tell you this not because I came to talk about this book, but because I started thinking about my own childhood. And I started thinking about my growing up in Israel. I was born in the mid-1950s. So I was born much less than 10 years after the Nakba. Everything happened before my generation was born. There was World War II, there was the Holocaust, there was what in Israel is called the War of Independence, and there was the Nakba. What was the Nakba? Was the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population for what became the state of Israel. 750,000 people who were driven out by intimidation, series of massacres that took place, the most famously the Deir Yassin, but there were many others also in the Galilee. And what had been a Palestinian civilization was erased, disappeared. And I grew up in the mid-late 50s, early 60s, before 1967, before the war, the Six-Day War, surrounded by those remnants. My friends and I, when we were kids, we used to play in so-called abandoned villages. One village, Shahwanis, is where the University of Tel Aviv is now. But when I was a kid, it hadn't been established yet. And there were remnants of that village. And we used to play cops and robbers there. There was a cemetery there, a Muslim cemetery. But nobody told us anything about what happened. And my parents were soldiers in the war of 1948. Many of their friends died. They belonged to the generation that went out to fight in the war. There were many stories they never told, that they took with them to their grave. But we grew up with this void, with this thing that you didn't talk about. And it took many decades, and for many people it hasn't happened yet, to think what it was that happened there, that erased this whole culture, that disappeared. So my own experience was one where the story of the Holocaust and the story of the Nakba, which are not comparable cases at all, they're very, very different, merged. They were connected to each other. They were inextricably connected to each other. My father volunteered when he was 17 to fight in the Jewish brigade of the British Army. And he fought in Italy against the German army. And then he was an occupation soldier in Germany and in the Netherlands. And he encountered the survivors of the Holocaust. That was an experience that he carried to the end of his life. He was a novelist, he wrote various books about this. And he was a soldier in the War of 1948. And many of the people who fought in 1948, many of the Jewish soldiers, about 30% of them at least, were survivors of the Holocaust. So, and many of them were people who lost all their property, all their family, their homes. And many of them moved into the homes of the people who were displaced, who were kicked out, literally, in 1948. So these stories are deeply connected. And I was thinking about that, and I won't go on speaking about that, but I was thinking about that as I was thinking about writing that book that I haven't written yet. And then October 7th happened. And as you heard, as Enrico was saying, once the attack by Hamas happened, and there should be no questions about that, the attack by Hamas was a war crime, it was a crime against humanity. About 800 civilians, mostly Jewish, there were others who were not, but the majority were Jewish and Israeli citizens, were murdered. Old people, children, women. There were reported cases of rape. We'll never know exactly what happened because the Israeli government decided not to have a state commission of inquiry that would have helped actually figure out precisely what happened. And even if there is one, it'll be years after the event. It'll be much more difficult to reconstruct it. But that was a massacre, or a series of massacres. There's no question about that. But once that happened, many people, including myself, hearing the statements being made by Israeli political leaders and military leaders, became deeply worried. Because the statements that were being issued by people like Yoav Gallant, then the Minister of Defense, and a man who was respected, unlike the current Minister of Defense, was not particularly respected in any circles in Israel. But Yoav Gallant was a general, was in the commandos, was a man who was perceived to be of integrity. Within a couple of days after October 7th, he had a meeting that was recorded, said they will have no food, they will have no water, they will have no power, they are human animals, and they will be treated appropriately. Now, when a man like this says that, who is now the Minister of Defense, who is a man who is respected by many Israelis, and at the same time, hundreds of thousands of reservists are being called up, about 350,000 reservists were being called up. And they hear him say that, that of course had an effect on the population. The president of the state, who is not even a member of the Likud party, was once the candidate of the Labour Party for Prime Minister, Yitzhak Herzog, said, there are no uninvolved people. It's a mistake to think that there are people not involved. Everybody is involved. He then tried to sort of backtrack, but that saying stuck. Netanyahu himself, of course, said, remember what Amalek did unto you. And the vast majority of Israelis know exactly what that means. And Israel become a much more religious country over time since I grew up there. And Amalek is a biblical people that attacked the Israelites from the rear when they were crossing the desert. And it's a divine injunction that people should be destroyed. Their sheep, their cattle, their men, their women, their children, their sucklings. That's what the Bible says. It's calling for genocide. And so these statements, there were many, many others, of course, were being made at the time. And I became increasingly worried because the information that was coming from Israel also showed that the IDF was doing, in some ways, what it had done in the past in Gaza, but on a much, much larger scale. For one thing, the vast numbers of reservists were called up, but the Air Force was also acting in ways that were completely unprecedented in bombing and destroying that very small piece of territory. And that was when I wrote this article about 4 weeks into the attack by Hamas. I think it came out on November 10th, 2023. The New York Times tried to spin it a bit to say that I was saying that there was no genocide. What I was saying in the article, which took 2 weeks or 3 weeks of negotiations with the Times, was that by then, over 10,000 people had been killed in Gaza. That was already unprecedented. And the assumption was, and it turned out to be true, that most of those people were civilians. And it appeared quite likely that there were war crimes committed, because this appeared to show the use of excessive force, destruction of entire neighborhoods, bombing with one-ton bombs, which destroy entire blocks, and a great deal of use of artillery and so forth, tank fire. So there appeared to be a great deal of evidence that there were war crimes, and because of the large numbers of civilians that were already killed, it appeared that there were good grounds to say that there were also crimes against humanity. Because if you kill such large numbers of civilians, you could be accused of systematic killing of civilians. And what I wrote is that if this is not stopped, then this could become genocide. In fact, I wrote, it's better to warn about genocide before it happens than to lament it after it has already taken place. Now, one has to remember, when I used the term genocide, I wasn't using a term of outrage. I wasn't saying this is terrible, what's happening, it must be genocide. And a lot of us do that, and that's one of the problems with the term. I was referring specifically, and I wrote about that in that piece, to the Genocide Convention of 1948. The Genocide Convention, which was in part a result of the labors of Raphael Lemkin, who was a Jewish-Polish lawyer who started thinking about this particular type of crime already in the 1930s. Originally, what he was thinking about was the genocide of the Armenians. And pushed, after he escaped from Poland, where most of his family was murdered, wrote a book in 1944 that defined, as he understood it then, genocide, and pushed for a UN convention. Once the UN was established, and in 1948, that convention was adopted. It came into force in 1951. And that convention is called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So just by the title, you understand it's not only about, let's wait until we see if it's genocide and then maybe we'll do something about it. It's about the prevention of that crime. If you see that it's about to happen, and then punishment of those who might have carried it out, and making every effort possible to stop it. And genocide is described in the Genocide Convention as acts carried out with the intent to destroy a particular group, an ethnic or a national or racial or religious group, in whole or in part as such. And there are subsections there. What are these actions? They include killing members of the group. They include causing severe physical and mental harm to members of the group. They include creating conditions which would be conducive to causing harm to the group. So that's indirect, causing death or mutilation or illness and so forth. And it includes also preventing births in the group. That is making it difficult for women to give birth, making it difficult for children born to survive. And finally, the last action is kidnapping children from the group and transferring them to the other group, which is one crime that President Putin is accused of and is not actually relevant to the case of Gaza. The first four are. And so at the time when I wrote that, my hope was that someone in the American administration would pay attention. We had then a Democratic president, we had a Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, whose stepfather was a survivor of the Holocaust. In fact, for a while, I carried the name of my own chair. It was the Samuel Pisar Chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Samuel Pisar was Antony Blinken's stepfather and a survivor of Auschwitz. I won't go into the reasons why that name has been removed from my name chair, but I'll allow you to guess. And there was hope that the administration would act. And what was extraordinary was that it was absolutely clear that had the administration decided to stop this, had President Biden told Benjamin Netanyahu, you have a week or 2 weeks to wrap this up, and then if you don't, you're on your own, Israel would have stopped. And of course, we've seen since this a lot of evidence with another president. When he says stop, Israel has to stop. And the reason is not necessarily the charisma or the bullying of one president or another. The reason is that Israel cannot conduct a long-term campaign without constant supply of arms, of economic help, and of a diplomatic iron dome. That is, that the US has veto power in the Security Council. And if the US says you have to stop and you don't, and the supplies of arms stop or are limited, economic help is limited, and the US does not use its veto power, then Israel will be very quickly subjected to sanctions. There's no question about it. Everybody knows that. And yet the administration didn't do that. And I still believe to this day that had Biden in November or December said that, we might have said, and I did not rush to the conclusion to say on week one this was a genocide, because I didn't think that it had reached that pretty high bar. Had the administration acted in November or December, we might have said, yes, there was a horrible attack by Hamas, there was a brutal response by Israel, there were clearly war crimes, potentially crimes against humanity. It almost became a genocidal campaign, but it was stopped. But it wasn't so. And so I continued following this. Obviously, I was hardly alone, consulting with people and getting information wherever I could. And my own process of thinking was, by May and June of 2024, that those statements that had been made by political leaders, which were and still are often described as They were made in the heat of the moment. People were very angry, of course, after what happened on October 7th. They were irresponsible, but they were not beyond that. There was no plan. It was just people were really mad. By May of 2024, it turned out that the actions of the IDF throughout this period, from October to May, followed a particular pattern of operation. And that's the other way that you can show intent. You know that in defining genocide, you need to show that there's an intent. And one way to show intent is that people say, I want to do it. And there are people with executive power. That's a pretty good indication of intent. But the other way of showing intent, as the ICJ has actually ruled, is the International Court of Justice, is to show a pattern of operations. And by May 2024, it appeared clear that there was a pattern of operation that conformed to those statements. That the pattern of operation was to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population, to systematically destroy housing, schools, mosques, universities, water power plants, agricultural land, museums, archives, everything that allows a population to live, to survive, to educate itself, but also to reconstitute itself after mass violence. Now, the goal appears to have been ethnic cleansing. And there were many statements along these lines during that time. That is, we are doing Nakba number 2, which is always interesting because the Nakba was denied, but then there were the same people who denied the Nakba were saying, but we're doing it again. But this time we'll finish the job. The difference between what happened in 1948 and what happened in 2023, 24, 25 was that in 48, the borders were open. And Palestinians fled. They fled because they were terrified, because they were intimidated, because army units came into the villages, executed people in the public square, and people got the message and ran. And there were places to run to. They ran to Jordan, they ran to Syria, they ran or took boats, certainly from Haifa to Lebanon. People fled. In Gaza, you couldn't sleep. There was no place to go to. The borders with Israel were obviously closed, and those are the long borders. You couldn't go into the sea because you would be killed. And the only place that the Israeli forces wanted the Palestinians to go to was to cross into Egypt. And that's why the pattern of operation, which militarily made very little sense, if you want to deter Hamas, you don't systematically go from north to south. You would do something a bit more imaginative than that. But the goal was not that at all. The goal was to push the population from the north to the south. So that in May 2024, there were 1 million people in Rafah, which is the southernmost city of Gaza. Before the war, it had a population of about 260,000, 270,000. So all these other people were people being displaced. The IDF told them, and there were statements every day by the spokesperson of the IDF, you have to leave your homes for your own safety because this area is becoming an area of operations. They left their homes, and their homes were blown up. In fact, in May 2025, that's 2 years later, Benjamin Netanyahu was cited as saying, there's no place to go to. We have destroyed their homes. Our only problem is to find countries that will take them in. But of course, these countries didn't materialize. And so when the IDF came to Rafah, half of the population of Gaza was concentrated there. And the US administration was telling the Israelis, you can't go in there. You're going to kill more and more civilians. And so what the IDF did was to move those people about 1 million people to Al-Mawasi, to the coastal area in southwestern Gaza, which had absolutely no humanitarian infrastructure whatsoever. And they moved into Rafah and flattened it. By August, there was nothing standing. The whole place was destroyed. It was at that point that I felt that I had no choice but to identify what we had seen as the implementation of a plan, of an operation, whose goal was initially to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, and which turned into a genocidal operation. Now, that's not new in history. That's quite common. The German genocide of the Herero and Nama people in German Southwest Africa in 1904 was very similar in that sense. There was an uprising by the Herero. The German settlers called in the German military. 10,000 German soldiers came. Took them a while because the technology of the time, but they came and they drove the Herero into the desert where most of them died. They died because they blocked the water holes, they killed the warriors, and those who remained were actually enslaved. They were even given name tags. This was an early phase of what later we see in the concentration camps. They were made into forced laborers. In the Armenian genocide, the Armenian genocide begins as an attempt by the Ottoman authorities in 1915 to drive the Armenians out of where they're living. Of course, the argument is they're collaborating with the Russians, they're an internal enemy, and so forth. And that becomes a genocidal operation. And in fact, that's how the Holocaust begins. The genocide of the Jews does not begin with killing of Jews. The genocide of the Jews begins with Judenpolitik in Germany in the 1930s. Its goal is to drive the Jews out. In fact, in the mid-1930s, the Nazi authorities had an agreement with the Yishuv, with the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine, the leadership of that community, the Jewish agency, for the Hazara agreement, the transfer agreement. And 70,000 German Jews, most of them not Zionists, end up in Palestine. They're saved thereby. So at that point, the goal of the German government is to be rid of them. Like, go to Palestine, go anywhere. This was the slogan in Poland in the 1930s. Anti-Semites in Poland used to call out, go to Palestine. So there was a kind of anti-Semitic Zionism of the period. So what you saw happening in Gaza was not something new in that sense. It has happened before, and one could have anticipated that. One could have understood that this was what was in the works. So I'll take you now a few steps back, because then I wrote about this in August of 2024 in The Guardian, in a long article, and then I wrote about it again in July of 2025, and that was an article because it was the New York Times. It got a great deal of coverage. The title was not mine, but this time it was a good title by the New York Times. I'm a genocide scholar. I know one when I see one. It was in the text, but I didn't think of it as a title. And by then, unlike summer of 2024, a consensus had been formed among, I would say, a majority of genocide scholars and experts in international law, including some people who were very conservative and very cautious about applying the concept of genocide to what was happening in Gaza. A consensus was formed that indeed that had been, and I hesitate to speak in past tense because we don't know exactly where things are heading right now. We're in a kind of poor situation, but that had been a genocide. Now, I'll contextualize this a little bit. And I'll contextualize it in part because you may know that Gutierrez, the Secretary General of the UN, sometime after October 7th, said in a public speech, we must think about October 7th in context. And he was immediately attacked by the Israeli government, by the various spokespeople, by diplomatic representatives. There is no context. It was a massacre. It was a brutality. When you say there's a context, you are trying to excuse it. But of course, there is a context. Things don't happen just like that out of the blue. So there's a more narrower context and a larger context. And I'll just say a few words about both. The narrow context is that Benjamin Netanyahu, in particular, there's a huge amount of evidence of that by now, had a particular policy vis-a-vis Palestinians. And you have to remember that between the Jordan and the sea, there's one state. We can say there's an occupation, however we call it, there's one state. That is, this territory is controlled by Israel. In that state, there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians. The 7 million Jews have democratic rights, although those rights are actually being eroded as we speak. There's a great deal of reason to be anxious about that too. The 7 million Palestinians do not have equal rights. 2 million of them are Israeli citizens, but don't have equal rights. And since 2018, the Israeli basic law, Israel is the nation state of the Jews, that's the name of the law, they formally don't have equal rights. And Arabic is not formally recognized as the second official language. The 3 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank have no rights at all. They live under an arbitrary military regime. What we associate with rights, say, if you're arrested, you have to be accused of something. You don't have to be accused of anything. If you are in prison, there has to be some legal process. There doesn't have to be a legal process. If you're a child, you should be protected. Well, Palestinian children are defined very differently from Israeli children. And so you have in the West Bank two populations living side by side, one which is Palestinian, and basically has no rights, and most Israelis don't think that it has even the right to have rights. And you have the second population, which is now about 700,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, who are extraterritorial Israeli citizens and who enjoy full rights as other Jewish citizens of the state. So an apartheid system was created where you have two populations living side by side, interacting with each other in various ways, but they're living under completely different legal regimes. And of course, it's not just that there's a different legal regime, there's a great deal of violence going on there at the moment. So Netanyahu, for the last 20 years or so, had a particular goal. And the goal is, I have to say, it was not just the goal of Netanyahu. The sort of general goal was a goal that you can trace back to the beginning, at least to the beginning of the state. That the state wants the land, but doesn't want the people living in it. Levi Eshkol, the Israeli prime minister, said after 1967 about people wanted to immediately annex the occupied territories, you want the dowry, but you don't want the bride. That is, you want the land, but you don't want the people. But Netanyahu, after the failure of Oslo and after the assassination of Rabin, which basically was the death toll for any attempt to find some solution to this, chose a particular policy, which was that Israel can manage the occupation. And this was a term that everyone used. Again, it wasn't just the far right, it wasn't just the Likud party, it was people like, say, Tom Segev, who was a liberal, is still, slightly less liberal now, but it's in his 80s. um, use the term, we don't know how to solve this, we have to manage it. We have to manage the occupation. Now, managing the occupation meant, of course, increasing encroachment on lands in the West Bank and closing in the population of Gaza. It became a blockade that lasted 16 years. In August of 2023, during those massive protests that were happening in Israel to protect the Supreme Court from that judicial overhaul, a number of colleagues and myself issued a manifesto. This was August 4th, I think, 2023, which we called the elephant in the room. And we said that all those well-meaning, liberal, mostly secular Israeli citizens who were protesting against the attempt to undermine the rule of law in Israel were refusing to talk about the main cause of this, which was the occupation. And we appealed to the leaders of the protest movement to speak about that, and they refused. They said, well, this is an issue, yes, but not now. Now we have to protect our own rights, first of all. On October 7th, managing the occupation blew up. That was the end of it. Netanyahu had, for a long time, at least 10 years, considered Hamas to be an asset. Why would Hamas be an asset? Because Hamas is a very extreme organization. And you can say that there's nobody we can talk with. There's the PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and they're corrupt and nobody trusts them, so you can't talk with them. They're basically working for the Israeli authorities. And you have Hamas, who are very radical. So we don't have a choice, we just have to manage the occupation. That entire policy blew apart on October 7th. And because it blew apart, there had to be something to replace it. What do you do? And there obviously were two choices. One choice was to say, well, yes, Hamas is very extreme. We have to find measures to destroy this organization. You can't destroy Hamas as an ideology, but you can marginalize it. You can appeal to the population in Gaza and say, look, Hamas was ruling over you in ways that became increasingly unpopular within the population of Gaza itself. Help us remove them, and we will help you create a good place for yourself. And let's do that within the context of actually trying to solve this particular issue of two populations of equal numbers living side by side, one of which oppresses the other. How do we resolve this? But that was not the policy of this government. So having failed to manage the occupation, the best solution that the government came up with and found wide support for, certainly in the early months, by wide parts of the population, I'd say the majority of the population, was just kick the bastards out, just destroy them. Again, go back to 1948, and let's wake up one morning and they won't be there. And we won't ask any questions, where they went, how it happened, just be rid of them. So one context for this is an obvious context, which is that Israel, for the last 59 years, has been an occupied country. And differently from many other countries that have had colonial rule of one type or another, it is all happening in very small territory in which there are equal numbers of both groups. This is not a situation where one group can be moved out. They're sitting there side by side. And the only way for them to have a better life is to find a way to coexist. The only other solution, which is now largely what is being implemented, is to make their lives, the lives of Palestinians, so miserable, so wretched, that eventually they will leave. And of course they haven't, and the ethnic cleansing of Gaza has failed. But there's a much larger context, and I'll end with that so that we have time also for conversation. And that's really the main question that I asked in the book. So I opened the book asking what was wrong. Now, I have to say that people who see the title, often I get two responses. One response is, what do you mean what went wrong? It was wrong from the very beginning. The whole thing was, Zionism was a genocidal ideology. The whole idea of Jewish nationalism, it was bound to lead to what ended up in Gaza. And I don't agree with that, and I'll say a couple of words about that, but that's one response. And the second response is from the other side of the political map, who says the only thing that went wrong is me, and I even talk about this thing. And with that, I'm happy to accept that, but that I've irritated a lot of people. But it is the question that I asked. I asked, how is it possible that Zionism, as I understand it, which began in the latter part of the 19th century as a movement that tried to liberate, to emancipate the Jews of Europe, 80% of world Jewry lived in East Central Europe at a time of rising ethno-nationalism, violence, growing anti-Semitism, and more violence against Jewish communities, which were, wherever they lived, the minority. And Zionism proposed, we have to find some solution to this, to what emerged as the Jewish question. The Jewish question is something new. It's not an objective. It's a creator. It's a constructor. And Zionism proposed a particular answer to that. Initially, it was not at all the most popular answer in Jewish communities. Large numbers of Jews left Europe and went to America, 2.5 million of them, before World War I, from the 1880s to World War I. Millions of Jews went to North America. Other Jews tried to assimilate. Other Jews joined socialism and communism and became major figures in those movements. Over time, Zionism became increasingly popular. And the reason was that all these other choices weren't working so well. Now, the United States, after World War I, closed the gates of immigration. The US was going through what it is going through again now, of white nationalism. And after 1929, with the Great Depression, very few countries wanted to have immigrants, let alone all students who were not particularly popular in Western Europe, including in Jewish communities. And so the question was, where do we go? And what do we do? And Zionism proposed a solution. Go to your ancestral homeland. Now, if we look at the evolution of Zionism in the 1920s and 30s, we see two things happening at the same time. And it's often hard to keep both of them in your head because they're contradictory. One of them is that hundreds of thousands of Jews, about 400,000 Jews, migrate from Europe to Palestine. And that includes both my grandparents, both my grandfathers and grandmothers, coming in the 1920s and 1930s to Palestine. The rest of their families, of my family, those who stayed in Poland, not a single one of them came out of the war. They were all married. So Zionism promises to provide a safe haven to Jews, and in the 1920s and 30s, of course, under the aegis of the British Empire, which Zionism always knew it needed. It needed an empire to help it construct a Jewish homeland. Zionism actually delivers those people who came, many of them, as I said, not my grandparents were Zionists, but many people, certainly the 70,000 odd Germans who came, they mostly were not Zionists. They came because that was the only place that they could go to. And had they stayed in Germany, they would have been murdered. But on the other hand, those Jews who come in growing numbers to Palestine in the 1920s and 30s are coming to a land that is not empty, are coming to a land that is already populated. And that movement of large numbers of people coming from Europe and encroaching on the land, on the rights, on the identities of the people who are living there. We talk about now as Palestinian Arabs. That creates a growing conflict. From the point of view of the Palestinians who live in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s, what they are experiencing is settler colonialism. It doesn't look like anything else. It's people coming from Europe and taking over and creating a state with the help, at least until 1937, with the help of the British authorities, who don't have any particular plan for rights to the Arab population. That creates a conflict which, again, has two sides. One of that is that it is a typical settler colonial dynamic. People coming from the outside, taking over from the indigenous population. And the indigenous population trying to resist that, trying to protect itself. But the second thing that happens is that, unlike, say, the case in North America, in Canada, or the United States, or New Zealand, or Australia, the Palestinian population creates a national identity. It becomes an actual ethnic national group. Now, that process is in part in response to Zionism, in part it's part of a larger context of Arab nationalism. But the conflict becomes both a conflict that is typical settler colonialism and a conflict which is a national conflict between two groups that both define themselves as ethno-national groups who claim rights on that place and deny that the other group has any rights to it. And so we have this, these two faces of Zionism happening at the same time. And the question that I pose in the book, how is it possible that that Zionism, which initially appealed to humanitarian sentiments, that tried to find a solution to a people that was in fact persecuted and endangered, becomes, after 1948, with the establishment of the state, yes, a state ideology. A state ideology which is increasingly militaristic, increasingly expansionist, increasingly violent, and over time justifies ethnic cleansing, and since October 7th, has justified Zionism, and has justified genocide. How has that transformation occurred? That's what I try to explain in the book. I'll just say 2 words about that and I'll wrap up. For me, the crucial point is 1948. Now, it doesn't mean that, as I said before, there were trends that began already with Jewish settlement in the 1880s and certainly in the 1920s and 30s. But 1948 is a particularly crucial moment because in 1948, Zionism accomplishes its goal. It accomplishes it with fire and sword. It creates a Jewish majority state. That's what Zionism wanted. And he wanted it because it was a product of Jews being a minority. So it said, well, we'll have a state of our own, with our own police and army and Supreme Court and Prime Minister and so forth. So it has succeeded in creating a Jewish state, And it is a Jewish majority state because the vast majority of Palestinians who had lived in what becomes the state of Israel had been expelled. Now, at that point, the state faced a choice. It could have said to itself, now that we have accomplished this goal, Zionism has accomplished what it had set out to do in the 1880s, we can now create a good state for all its citizens. And there is a great deal of talk about that at the time. The state issues a Bill of Rights in its declaration, proclamation of the state. It does it also because of the UN. But it does issue that, and it promises to issue a constitution. And the constitution would supposedly have also defined its borders. But it never issues a constitution. It never defines its borders. Israel still has no official borders. It only has ceasefire lines. And Zionism is transformed thereby into a state ideology. It's at that moment that a particular trajectory can be seen where talk that had existed in the 1920s, in the 1930s, of how can this land be shared? Can these groups live side by side? Is completely rejected. And if we look into the future, and I finish with this, as I see it, Zionism as a state ideology following Gaza is bankrupt. It's no longer an ideology that can be resurrected. If you're an ideology that justifies genocide, then you can't continue. The state of Israel, of course, will remain. The state of Israel is internationally recognized. It is there to stay. But under that ideology, it will become a pariah state. It will become a state that will never be able to heal itself and will never find peace with its neighbors. And so the only way to move forward from this moment, if we don't want to see Israel falling into the abyss where it is now hurtling, and if we want a better life both for Palestinians and for Israeli Jews, none of whom is going anywhere. They're all staying right there. There has to be focus, concentrated, insistent pressure on that state to change its policies. And that there is no dynamic for that from within. That has to come from without. Obviously, first of all, from the United States, but also, of course, from Germany, which I'm sure you know, has been both a major supplier of arms to Israel, a major player in protecting Israel, and has itself been in a long-term process of denial of what anybody who's actually observing facts knows to be true. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, we'll now move to the Q&A. I have two rules. The first is that we will limit your time to speak. We don't go up to 90 seconds. Please try to be concise. And the second rule would be that the questions and comments are directed to the speaker. We don't want discussions between audience members. Please refer the questions and comments to the speaker.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about this sharp turn you mentioned in 48, because I don't quite understand that if you think that this earlier Zionism then is basically finished as soon as it has established the state, but wouldn't this whole idea of it being a Jewish majority state necessitate that it continues safeguarding that status? So putting rules in place that you have a majority and always can keep a majority, which, at least in my mind, there is a close connection to the idea of either ethnic cleansing or killing people because you need this majority. Or am I misunderstanding something there?
And maybe collect a few, otherwise I'm writing it down.
You can also ask, sorry, I forgot, you can also ask in German.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the ethnic cleansing as a Nakba, where most of the Arabs were expelled, 20% are still citizens of Israel. But you did not mention, and I asked you how to integrate that, the near complete ethnic cleansing of, say, all Arab countries, expelling the Jewish communities, and they settled them in Israel, and to call them, say, colonial settlers, say, the victims of ethnic cleansing. Just, I would love to hear your comment.
One more? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the speech. And secondly, I have to actually apologize today because I'm going to be very honest. This space is non-conducive to free speech based on experience. And I have to be very careful with the questions that I'm going to ask. So the thing is, you probably realize today that if a Palestinian was standing right in your place and has delivered the very same speech, accusations of anti-Semitism would be readily provided. You know, coupling genocide and the state of Israel in the same sentence is enough anti-Semitic for this space. So my question to you is, what is your connection to a space that intellectually eliminates Palestinians and the voices of the other group that you were talking about? Or what's your relationship with the system that eliminates Palestinians in that way, not necessarily in the way that you're reproducing, knowledge structures or whatever, that are, in line with this institution or like an institution that would eliminate Palestinians, but rather what's your relationship with a place that gives you priority over another?
Okay. So first of all, about 1948. The conceit of Zionism, although the word doesn't actually appear in the proclamation of the state from May 14th, 1948, is that it can be Jewish and democratic. That's actually at the core, the root issue. Can Israel be Jewish and democratic? And it's a long-term conversation. Barak, who was the best-known justice, president of the Supreme Court, and passed two basic laws, or helped pass two basic laws in 1992, which spoke about the state as being Jewish and democratic, believed that it was possible. And I think it was wrong. Israel could be a Jewish and democratic state if it were made only or in its vast majority of Jews. But if it is not, even if we're speaking about 20%, and by the way, the ratio of 20% that existed in 1948 is the same ratio today. The numbers have grown, but it's exactly the same ratio of Jewish Israeli citizens and Palestinian citizens of Israel, 80 to 20. No, it can't do that. In the early 1990s, this was actually the conversation. During the Oslo process, the conversation was about creating a state of all its citizens. Why would you say a state of all its citizens? Because it wasn't the state of all its citizens. But it failed. It failed not least because of extraordinary incitement by the Israeli right, including Benjamin Netanyahu, the assassination of Rabin. And so, no, you have to reinvent the state. So the state tried to do something, that is, it tried to claim to be a democracy, but it couldn't be one without rethinking what it was about. You could have an ethno-national movement. There were many ethno-national movements that Zionism just copied. Ukrainian nationalism, Polish nationalism. Zionism took all those elements from those very same movements because that's where the Zionists were created. But in Palestine, they could not do it. You can either have a purely Jewish state or you have to reinvent it. And we have come to the point that, let me put it that way, Israel, strictly speaking, was a democracy only for about 6 months. Because as the state was proclaimed, there was still ethnic cleansing going on, but the state said that those Arabs who will remain in the state will have equal rights. And those who remain, 150,000 of them, the moment the war is over, the state imposes military rule over them. And it lasts until December 1966. So they don't have equal rights for those 20 years. And the military rule is not just to control them, it's to take their lands away. So much of their land is expropriated by the state and then given to Jewish settlers. Between December 66 and June 1967, there is a democracy. But then comes 67. And after 1967, Israel becomes a state, half of whose population are unequal. And it's been like that to this day. So no, you can't do that. But what I try to argue is that had there been a constitution, and this is not a fancy idea, there was a great deal of conversation over that. And the state had promised to the international community to have a constitution by October 1st, 1948. The constitution would have possibly made a difference. It would have made a difference vis-a-vis, first of all, Palestinian citizens of the state. It would have been very difficult to do what the Supreme Court did had it been overruled by or controlled by a constitution that provided equal rights. But the Supreme Court, of course, actually facilitated between 48 and 66 expropriation of Arab land. And after 67, the same Supreme Court that was defended by Israeli liberals is the Supreme Court that created civil status for Jewish settlers in the West Bank. In other ways, the Supreme Court actually facilitated the creation of an apartheid system in the West Bank. The same Supreme Court that people in the hundreds of thousands were protesting to protect, because it protected them. But vis-a-vis Palestinians, no. So, yes, you have to go back now to 1948, but had there been a constitution, it would have constrained the state, and it would have constrained the court. It could have also, I think, and there were discussions about that, it's not fanciful, that there would be a process of some kind of repatriation of some of the Palestinians who were expelled, and a process of compensation, of restitution. This was being spoken about. And the constitution would have made it more likely. And the third crucial thing that I didn't speak about today, Israel has transformed itself not only into a state that is more and more engaged with being ethnically Jewish, but also more and more religiously Jewish. And by now, Israel always had the theocratic element. I mean, you can't have civil marriage in Israel. There's a whole set of rules that Ben Gurion already agreed to in the so-called status quo agreement. But had there been a Supreme Court, had there been a constitution that would have provided this kind of Bill of Rights, it would have been much more difficult for the growing religious authorities, the growing power of the religious authorities to transform the state into something that is becoming increasingly theocratic. I'm not naive. I don't think that constitutions can come and go. You can change them. You can throw them out. But it might have made a difference. On the second question, and I'm sorry if I can't answer everything. On the ethnic cleansing on one hand and the Mizrahim on the other, I'll say really briefly, most of the violence against and pushing Jews out of Arab countries, be it Morocco, be it Iraq, is after the Nakba. The vast majorities are after the Nakba. Absolutely. There's no question about it. In the 1950s and 1960s, you can look at the figures. Initially, the largest immigration to Israel, to the new state, is about 300,000 Romanians, and then comes the Moroccan immigration later on in the 1950s. Much of this is a result of response in Arab countries to the fact that Israel was created, and it was created by ethnically cleansing large numbers of Palestinians. Now, that is not to say that there was no anti-Jewish sentiment in Muslim countries. There was. It is to say, however, that the situation of Jews in the 19th century in Arab countries was far better than the situation of Jews in Europe in the equivalent period. And that's one reason why there were fewer Jews from Arab countries. There was a Yemenite immigration, but there were few Jews from Arab countries who came to Palestine. Now, what is absolutely true and is fascinating and sort of sad story, really, is that Jews who came from Arab countries to Israel, and they were Middle Eastern, they were Arab. They don't want to be called, most of them, Arab Jews because it's a derogatory term in Israel. But of course they are, or they were. They could have been the link between Jews who came from Europe, who saw themselves as superior because they came from, Stetach, like my mother's, They thought they were superior over Jewish intellectuals who came from Baghdad, right? So there was this kind of Orientalist attitude. But those Mizrahi Jews could have actually created and acted as the connection between Jews who came from Europe and the local population. But that was not the dynamic of what happened. The dynamic was that in order to become a full-blown Israeli, you had to shed your Mizrahi identity. There's a whole generation of people, some of the people that I interviewed also in that project of interviews, they abandoned their parents. They wanted to become Israeli. What did it mean to become Israeli? To merge into Israeli society. It was to become Ashkenazi. It was to be secular. It was to wear shorts. It was to Chakri or Yarmulke. It was to speak Hebrew like Israelis, not to have the proper accent of Hebrew. That is to actually pronounce Ha and Ra and all those sounds that disappeared in Ashkenazi Hebrew. They had to dump all of them in order to become part of that society. That's an extraordinary process. And at the core of much of the dynamic of Israeli politics today is the resentment that generations of Mizrahi Jews have toward the Ashkenazi elite. What they remember that their parents went through, the humiliation, the putting down, the talking about them as animals, talking about them as primitive. I still remember it. This is within my own lifetime. So it's a tragedy. And finally, Hannah Arendt, when she was reporting about the actual trial, wrote characters, not just about the trial. She described the characters. There's a famous letter by her. And she says, the judges they're really cultivated people. They were German Jews, they're judges. The Attorney General, he's an Ostjude. He behaves like, and the policemen, they're like Arabs, they're primitive. Because these were Iraqi Jews who were policemen. So that kind of mentality that existed at the time toward people who came from Arab lands, and the necessity of those people who wanted to become part of Israel, and how they were transformed into the population that is most supportive of the Israeli right. That's a population that carried Menachem Begin into power in 1977. Menachem Begin, who spoke Hebrew with a Polish accent, he was the king of Moroccan Jewry. It's a result of that putting down. So yes, of course, Israel is not only people who came from Europe. They're not the majority now because of the Russian immigration, but a very large part of the population actually hails back to the Middle East. But unfortunately, the way Israeli politics worked was to instead of using this, instead of actually saying, this is how we can become part of the culture that we went to, of the region that we went to, exactly the opposite happened. And there's a wonderful book about that by Hillel Cohen called Haters, Lovers, or Lovers, Haters. So Haters, Lovers, about the triangular relationship between Mizrahi Jews, Palestinians, and Ashkenazi Jews. It hasn't come out in English. I hope it will, but it talks exactly about this. And the last question on, look, I mean, am I aware of this? Of course I'm aware of this. So, first of all, I'll say this. Some people told me, rightly, that my book is not about Palestinians. Why don't I have Palestinians in the book? And I mean, of course, I talk about Palestinians, but I'm talking from the point of view of Israelis and Zionism. And the reason is that I'm not Palestinian and I cannot speak for Palestinians. I don't feel that I have a right to speak for Palestinians. The reason that and that's how I started today, the reason that I decided to do this project of interviews, which will be a book, is that I wanted Palestinians to speak for themselves, not for me to speak for them. And this book will be their voices. It's not, I'm just orchestrating this. I want them to speak for themselves. I can't speak for them. I can't even speak for all Jewish Israelis because there are people from communities that I know very little about. Certainly religious communities. I had no religious upbringing at all. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, yes, I am doubly privileged. I'm old, I'm retiring, I was an Israeli, I am an Israeli, I'm an Israeli citizen. I served in the Israeli military for 4 years. I was in a war. I shed blood for that country. I wrote about the Holocaust, and anybody who wants to describe me as anti-Semite is welcome to it. They can say whatever they like. I don't give a damn. But if I were Palestinian, if I were Muslim, non-Palestinian, and I have colleagues, who are not Palestinian, or who might be Pakistani or Lebanese or Egyptian, if I were just a regular American, neither one or the other, if I worried about my career and thought, I mean, am I going to be promoted, or is the university going to say, oh, well, it's a troublemaker? I don't know what I would have done. What I do know is that when colleagues of mine tell me, and it's happened to me a lot, that they admire my courage, I take pause. Because they're not speaking up. They're not talking. In the first article that I wrote in the Times, and then I repeated that in July of 2025, I called upon institutions whose goal is to commemorate the Holocaust, to research the Holocaust, not only as an event that happened in the past, but as a lesson for humanity, a universal lesson. And I asked colleagues of mine who, like me, were and are historians of the Holocaust to speak out. And the vast majority, with some very important exceptions, have refused. And no institution, or hardly any institution, has spoken out. And first of all, it's a tragedy, it's a travesty, it's a betrayal of what you claim to be. It's also destroying the very notion that you can teach and commemorate the Holocaust for universal lessons. If you don't draw those lessons now, when are you going to do it? So as I wrote in the Times, this may bring, there was a moment that Holocaust scholarship and museums and exhibitions and research institutions claim to, rightly, to have moved from the sort of ethnic ghetto that this is just about Jews speaking about what happened to Jews to something that matters to the rest of the world. But if you don't speak out in a moment of crisis, then you have forfeited that right. You can't do that anymore. So yes, I'm aware of that. And I frankly am still hoping that some people will finally speak up.
Thank you. We'll have very short questions. Very short answers.
Slightly different personal questions, so people can answer them. But your first article in the Times, where you say you feel like they try to misrepresent you, I just feel especially with the title. And I've seen that title kind of in that time, just kind of shown and quoted a lot by people who I also were twisting the article to say something that you didn't mean. Do you regret the article because of this kind of usage that people got out of it, or would that not happen anyway?
You mean the first one in November 2020?
I think I have to criticize the outlook on Zionism. So Zionism was like designed as a settler movement from the start. Like in Europe, they said we want to colonize Palestine. They had set up colonization agencies. They, when they came to Palestine, with support of the British, they started building parallel institutions, Jewish institutions, which were predispositions to take over power after a possible departure of the British, and which they did in 1948. So it's very hard for me to see how a movement that says we're a colonial movement, today we would say settler colonial movement, that seeks to colonize Palestine and sets no borders from the beginning, and obviously the Zionists are the ones starting to build institutions and educating the Jewish population in this sense, how there could be any other way. On the other hand, there's also the point of like, what kind of resistance have you ever seen in Israel against like this settler colonial process of dispossessing Palestinians and building settlements? For example, the labor movement after '67, they were building themselves as well. So and not stopping to build. So these are my two questions.
Okay, I will make it short. I've been watching the Palestine Israeli politics since like 10 years, and the trial against Netanyahu. That because its influence on the media, on the broadcast, and yeah, I've been wondering. Do you think there's a chance that that when all is over, we're hoping for it, that also the trials against Smotrich and Bahia
and all the other far rights, so that they will become like peace in the Israeli society. Short answer.
One last question.
One last question.
The calls for the testing mothers and children, Palestinian children, candidated in 2013 with Ali Ben Dahan or with Ayman Shakir, who was then rewarded by becoming the Minister of Justice and Minister of Interior Affairs. So there have been signs that genocide is coming one way or the other. Why there has not been totally about that until 2023?
Okay, I'll really try to be short. Do I regret the article from 2022? No, not at all. In fact, in my mind at least, that article tried to depict what was going on and to warn from what might happen. It didn't have the effect. I didn't have any influence on the administration, and nobody asked my opinion. But it did get a great deal of attention. And I felt at the time that that was the right thing to do. And for me, there was a clear line between that article of November 23 and the article I wrote in July 25. And the third piece that I'm hoping, because with the New York Times, you never know, but there is another one in the pipeline that is about the future of Gaza and the future of genocide. And I see actually a progression in my own thinking and understanding and in how I'm trying to explain to a larger public what I think has been happening, in large part because there's been such an enormous amount of obfuscation, of confusion, of intimidation, of ignorance, of propaganda, that large numbers of people just don't know what to say and what to think. And the responses that I've received for these articles were often, obviously there were people who wrote me that I'm a couple and that I'm self-making Jew and so forth. But the more interesting communications that I received were for people who thanked me for just providing them with some information and some analysis. And so I don't regret that at all, on the contrary. The second question, look, Zionism was exactly as you described it. Zionism said it wants to colonize Palestine. They didn't call it Palestine, they call it Eretz Israel, but that's what they wanted to do. They made no bones about it. They built colonials. They changed it to Moshavot, but of course. So there's no question about that. What I'm saying is there was in Zionism a different dynamic. I dedicated my book to my father, who died in 2016 at the age of 90, and who in the last years of his life constantly spoke about Netanyahu as the wrecker of Zionism. And I dedicated to him as the last Zionist. And what do I mean when I say the last Zionist? Because there are a lot of people today who claim to be Zionists. But the kind of Zionism that he believed, and the kind of Zionism that I grew up in, because I wasn't educated as a Zionist, I was just born in Israel, and I took everything for granted. But the kind of Zionism that those people have had a very different quality. Yes, it was about settlement. It was also about transformation. It was about transforming, about normalizing Jewish existence. If you read about it, it's quite interesting. And it had a belief that it had, a humanistic, socialist, rhetoric of equality, of justice. So you can say about a lot of those people that they were either naive or they were lying or we can't take them at face value, and you might be right. But it did have these two different aspects. And you need to understand, if you think about nationalism, and about ethno-nationalism, Zionism didn't invent anything. You think about this country, and you think about what kind of nationalism it had, what kind of ethno-national racist attitudes it had, long before the Nazis. You can't have only one thing and not the other. You have to somehow recognize that in societies, in ideologies, there are moments that are filled with contradictions. There are people who actually believe that they're doing the right thing, that they're being just, that they are trying to liberate, that they're trying to emancipate. And at the same time, they become engaged in oppression, in violence. That's the contradiction that to me is much more interesting than deleting an entire phenomenon. As I said, there is an existential aspect to this. The fact of the matter is that those people who came there survived, and those who didn't were murdered. That too plays into that, and one can't reverse that. One can't say, well, they should have come up with a better idea. That's the idea they came up with, and it saved them, and yet it became something that by now is no longer justifiable, that by now has transformed itself. And I'm a historian, I don't believe in determinism in history. I don't think that everything that happened had to happen. But what has happened is that Zionism now has indeed become an ideology that cannot be supported, that must be discarded. But I don't think it began like that, and I think that this kind of attitude is, how should I put it, makes one, feel good about oneself, but doesn't explain much about the actual course of history. On the question of trials, look, I mean, I certainly hope. Who was it? Yeah. I certainly hope that there will be trials. There won't be in Israel. I don't see any of these people standing, having accountability in Israel, not in the next few decades. I'm hoping to live long enough to see Benjamin Netanyahu there. Now, it's possible if there's a new Israeli government, not the next one, but maybe one or two down the road, and Israel has become increasingly a pariah state, and a new government wants to reintegrate it, and so it needs a scapegoat, and by then he will be really old and marginalized and ill, and they'll hand him over. And that would be a good thing. It'll be late, it'll be, insufficient, but all of these trials are always late, always insufficient, and most people, certainly in genocide, get away with murder. We know that. We know that from this country. Most people didn't pay a price for the crimes they committed. But there needs to be some accountability, because if there's no accountability, then the entire regime of international law is falling apart. And when in Germany, when we quote Angela Merkel, if the Staatsräson is to protect the state that is carrying out crimes, then it's undermined its own legitimacy. The Staatsräson has to be about protecting the entire regime of international law that was created as a result of what happened in World War II. To prevent that from happening, that's what it should be about. Not about protecting criminals or supplying them with, the Israeli Navy, which is made in Germany. So yes, there has to be that. But there has to be pressure for that. It doesn't come just like that. There has to be public pressure. And citizens everywhere should demand that, because, look, I mean, a lot of what you see happening today is not about ideology. It's about money, it's about power. This entire arms industry that has seen a bonanza. First the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then the wars that Israel is conducting. People are making vast amounts of money out of this, and are buying other people to protect them to continue making this money. So the public has to do something about it, and it is not being that impressive. Certainly not in Israel, but also not in Europe. And there was a question on genocide. Can you repeat that? Yes. Oh, yes, yes. Look, I mean, I'll tell you something. People like me, and there were quite a few people that I knew, had always thought that as you saw the change in Israeli politics and this sort of shift to the right and the increasingly violent discourse in the settlement movement, in the national religious, you could see that already in the 1980s, 90s, it was bubbling up, and it was murderous talk. So I think, I certainly thought that there could be a trigger that would release this kind of urge. So I think that's in genocide, yes, long before. And I was not the only one who thought that. But I believed, it turns out naively and stupidly, that if Israel were to do that, it would have to be really fun, because then the international community would kick in. I mean, people would say, no, enough. The US would say, okay, you've killed people, you've destroyed, now you have to stop. And nobody did anything. No one. Not Britain, not France, not Germany, not Italy, no one. And of course, not the United States. And this continued. And the result of that is first that there's complicity all around. Because it's not just that Israel was not stopped, Israel was assisted politically, economically, legally. It was assisted in that by its allies. And one has to say, I didn't say this, people will say, well, there were many other, which is true, many other genocides and many other horrible regimes between 1945 and today. But this, as far as I know, is the first case of genocide that was supported by Western allies and the United States, the very countries that claim to be the protectors of human rights and international law. They were part of it. So, so it is, of course, there was talk about it. And Israeli politics shifted increasingly to the right. So the year 2000, you can clearly see that. But there was no stopping it. And it's still continuing to this day. And the extraordinary irony is that someone like Donald J. Trump is a person who stopped the genocide in Gaza. He actually stopped it. Now, since then, 1,000 people were killed. But the vast numbers that were dying until October 25, that has diminished. That was because of him. Now, he didn't do it because he cares much about the lives of any people for his own interest. But it just showed that you can do it. Which means if you don't do it, why? Why are these countries not moving? Why are they not stopping Israel? Not only because they care about Palestinians, which they mostly don't, but because they claim to care about Israel. And this process has destroyed whatever was left in Israel, the rule of law, of democracy, of any liberal values, if there ever were some. The country itself is going down the drain because it has been allowed to behave in this way. So that, to me, it's not a mystery of why there was always violence in the area in Israel. There was, but why Israel was given this license for so long and is still enjoying that to this moment.
Okay, I think we'll conclude it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Omer Bartov.